So we thought probably the best place to kick off this video series was in a more of a big picture look at two kind of very different styles of approaching the writing process. And it seems, from what we have seen, that everybody kind of naturally seems to fall into one of these two approaches predominantly. And happily for our purposes, Adam and I kind of take the opposite approach of each other to the writing process. So we thought it might be a nice way to sort of kick off this video series by discussing the difference between sort of flying by the seat of your pants, if you will, or sort of framing your novel out in detail before you even begin, or sort of, you may have heard the terms like planning and pantsing, if you will. But we like to talk about it more in terms of kind of flying through things as you go versus sort of planning heavily before you launch into the actual writing process. So Adam, do you want to talk a little bit about what kind of the flying through things process looks like, that writing process, maybe some pros and cons of that?
Well, sure, Justin. I think before I get into that, though, I really liked your intro in terms of, you know, how we're here to help people get things rolling, and that we're not a critique group, that we're not planning to slog through pages and pages of people's stuff, but that really it's about accountability to help them get the book written. And what's the building block of a book? You know, is it a paragraph? Is it a sentence? Is it a word? Is it a letter? You know, is it a character? What really is the building block of a book? Well, I'm going to say, for the sake of the argument right now, it is a word. You have to start with a word and you have to end with a word, and there has to be a lot of words in between. So really the critical element in whether you frame your story a lot before you fill in or flesh out the gaps in your frame, or whether you fly by the seat of your pants and you just write a whole bunch of junk and then cut stuff out later. There's two things that has to happen no matter which way you do it. One is you have to write words. You have to write the first word, and you have to write the last word, and you have to write all the words in between. So it doesn't really matter which you prefer. That's almost like you're just born that way, to write that way.
Yeah.
So yeah. So then what was your question for me? I forget.
Why don't you sort of lay out what we mean by sort of flying through things, and what that has looked like for you in terms of style, maybe some pros and cons of that. I'll do the same for framing, and then we can sort of discuss where they meet in the middle.
Yeah, flying by the seat of your pants is the way I write, at least when it comes to fiction. And we're really primarily focused on fiction in this group. Flying by the seat of my pants means taking my laptop, going down to the local coffee shop, buy a cup of coffee, put some headphones in, listen to music, and just start writing. I may not have even necessarily an idea of where I'm going that day. And sometimes the ideas sort of come at touch points. Like I'll just get a little piece of inspiration and write on that for as long as I can. And I think there's a critical element to that too. People say that writing is, you know, 1% inspiration and 99% perspiration. And so if that's the case, which I believe it is, what you have to do is learn to milk the 1% of inspiration when you're flying by the seat of your pants for as long as you can, which is great because things can just pop out of our brains. Some people call it the muse. Some people there's lots of different terms for what that really is. And it's very mysterious and really fun when you tap into it. But the downside is when you run out of steam on a given touch point, if you have a long enough time, you might happen upon another one partway through and then ride that wave for a while. But it's like you're surfing from brainstorm to brainstorm, and you're just trying to coast as long as you can on that wave. This is interesting. I've never thought of it this way before. This is a brand new concept here, ladies and gentlemen. So you try to surf, you catch that wave, you see the foam come up, just like this brand new idea for a character or a phrase or some kind of something catchy that grabs your attention, and you just try to coast on it. Yeah. And then the downside is a couple of downsides. One is you have to edit the crap out of it, because you're going to have all this material that is really not taking you anywhere. And so you end up doing a lot more editing on the backside of your story, maybe than someone who does the framing the story up first. So I think that's probably the biggest drawback. And the other big drawback is you're sort of stuck sometimes when the waves stop coming, or when the sea goes flat and you don't have these little inspiration things. If you have something framed up, you're probably a lot more likely to be able to like grind out something in between point A and point B in the structure, or point F and point Q, whatever. But that's more for you to talk about, Justin, because that's the way you write. Tell us, Justin, what it's like to frame up a story and actually move that plot line forward. What are the pros and cons?
So for me, I have just always instinctively approached the writing process from that more kind of structured approach. And I sometimes will have entire writing sessions where all I'm really doing is thinking more abstractly about the story, what needs to happen, what's going to happen, when is it going to happen. And I'll put a lot of work and thought into what you could essentially just call like an outline for the most part. And I'll envision kind of, I tend to see the story as a whole as kind of high point scenes that I'm really clear on fairly early on. So I might have a really cool idea for sort of the ending and how everything's going to wrap up, and a couple of key moments in between that lead up to that. And then what I will tend to do then is to continue working on, in my own mind and on paper, filling in the distance between these sort of the high point moments that I have clear in my head with other scenes and other activity that's going to need to sort of take place to get me there. And for whatever reason, personality thing or just a preference thing or whatever, I find it really difficult to kind of settle in and start writing if there are big gaps between the high points that I'm clear on, because it feels like this, it's like this itch that I have a hard time not circling around to scratch. So to me, one of the pros of that process is that, like, by now, and I say, like I said in my intro, I am working on a novel. Part of the reason it's not done yet is because I have spent an inordinate amount of time framing the stupid thing, which means that I've sunk a lot more time and energy into the project than is necessarily apparent from sort of the fact that it's not done yet. So, and I guess I'll talk about that a little bit more as a con in a minute. But on the plus side, I have a really detailed outline, and I can tell you, I have my chapters numbered and titled from 1 to 17, and I know what happens in each one of them, and I'm about 2/3 of the way through, and I know exactly which ones still need to be written and what needs to happen in them. So to me, one of the big advantages of framing is that once you do the work to get all that in place, Adam, kind of like you were saying, on any given writing session, I don't have to wonder what I'm going to write. I tend to just sit down and pick up wherever I left off, and it's helpful to me to know, like, okay, today I'm writing the scene where, the main character escapes from this situation and XYZ needs to happen. And for whatever reason, I find it easier to sort of to cut loose and let that inspiration flow kind of sentence by sentence and page by page if I already know the broad strokes of what's going to happen, and I don't have to like take up my mental RAM with that kind of problem solving as I write. So that's one of the pros to me. I feel like my actual raw writing is better when I'm writing something that I've already planned than when I'm not. And again, that's just me. So that's one of the pros. I think one of the other pros is, to me, I find it enables me to kind of do a little bit more of kind of seeding those little cool aha moments into the plot. So for example, I know the location where my big final climactic events of my story are going to take place. So I've made a point of making sure that my character, and by extension the reader, actually visits that location for another reason early on in the book. And you get like a cool description of that location and what it's all about fairly early on in the story from kind of his perspective at that point. So by the time we get all the way to the end of the plot and kind of the big climax of the story is happening in that place, I think it's going to be kind of a cool effect for the reader, because it's going to be a place that they're already familiar with, and it's going to be a place that you're going to see a little bit differently in light of everything that's happened in the story to bring you to that point. And that's the kind of thing that I'm able to do because I know that the ending scene or the big climax scene of the whole story happens in that location. Which is just sort of a benefit to me of the framing process. Some fairly significant cons, though, and one of the ones that I've already mentioned is that it's very easy to spin your wheels for a long time and feel like you're getting a lot done and feel really good about like, yeah, I'm making all this progress. And really all you're doing is procrastinating the actual work of writing, which is to like sit down and actually bang out some pages, which is harder. And it's very easy to kind of sit back and be like, yeah, I'm having fun, I'm planning, I'm doing all this great work, but you can't sell an outline to anybody. It's not a story yet, so you have to write it. So that's one of the big cons, is it adds a little more time up front. And I don't know, maybe that one is one that sort of balances out in the end of the whole thing, because then at the end of the process, it requires an awful lot less editing because your finished product is more or less already structured like a story. So maybe that amount of time and effort is, as long as you're disciplined about both, kind of works out to be a bit of a wash. I don't know. But the other big sort of con that I've run into is that if you're actually doing the writing process well, in the sense that you're actually allowing your sort of your subconscious and your own sort of instinctive writing process to have free reign when you're writing, you are going to write some things that you didn't plan on. And some of your best ideas and your best crazy things that your characters will do are going to kind of wreck your beautiful, precise outline, and your like this lovely flower garden that you've laid out in neat little rows is just going to get totally trashed. And then you're kind of stuck with, oh, great, now the 8 chapters that I just wrote, are 2 or 3 of them are substantially no longer accurate anymore, because I just came up with this really cool idea for this thing that he's going to do, and it makes perfect sense, and now obviously that's got to be part of it, but it doesn't, the first 3 chapters don't make sense anymore, because now he's going to go do this thing. So you'll end up kind of, no matter how much framing you do in advance, if you're kind of actually letting yourself write freely, and you should, because you'll get your best stuff out of it, it's going to change what you framed. So I have kind of learned the hard way that there's sort of an upper limit on how much framing is actually useful. And beyond that point, you're really just kind of scratching your own itch and wasting your time to a degree with kind of coming up with these beautiful, precise outlines that are going to change anyway. And you're putting off the actual writing process. So to all the sort of framers out there, do yourself a favor, learn from some of my mistakes. Don't get too invested in that process. Planning is good, but it's not writing your book. And the process of writing your book is probably going to mess around with your plans pretty substantially. So that's definitely one of the cons that I have run into, is I probably wasted more time than I needed to waste. And I could be further along with a draft if I had just sort of let myself get to the writing process sooner.
Yeah, that's good, Justin. And there's a flip side to that too, which is if you're flying by the seat of your pants and you get to the point where I am right now at 85,000 words, realizing this thing is going to be longer than one novel. All of a sudden it occurred to me, this is going to be probably 180 to 200,000 words and 3 books. And I got to that 85,000 word point, which is almost as long as a lot of regular novels, and realized if I don't put some structure in place, I'm just going to get lost. I've got too many characters going on. I've got too much happening, too much potential happening. But I back to the whole surfing the waves concept. It sounds like when you're describing the framing way that you do it, It's like the difference between trying to cross the San Francisco Bay by surfing or by building a Golden Gate Bridge. And the problem is when you build all the pylons for the Golden Gate Bridge, you can get lost in the structure and forget to make it beautiful. So then when the beauty part starts happening, it's you talk about like a row of flower garden flowers in a row. It's like all of a sudden Godzilla came in, you know, and all of a sudden you've got an exciting story, but your flowers are a mess, you know?
Yeah.
So, you know, Godzilla in the flower garden is not a bad thing, but sort of as I was thinking about both of those things, then I'm thinking if I surf across the San Francisco Bay to the north side of California, I don't know exactly where I'm going to land when I get to the far shore. And the way you talked about building this bridge too is like, well, sooner or later, Godzilla stomps into the bay and knocks down one of your pylons, and you got to restructure it. And you might actually end up in a slightly different place on the far shore as well once your bridge is built and beautified. You know, I mean, it needs to have beautiful prose. It needs to be beautiful. So whether you're working at it from the perspective of starting with a lot of plot structure and a lot of outline, and then at some point you have to let her rip, I guess, and get her done, as they say, and really just start putting the magic in it. You're going to find out that you're going to end up someplace else possibly. And the same goes with when you're flying by the seat of your pants. At some point, if you don't put some structure to it, your readers are going to be like, well, that was a cool story, but there were like 8 plot lines that the guy forgot to tie up. So, yeah. So they both have to add a value to each other at some point in the process, or you're not going to have a good book.
And I think something that as you're talking in that thread that's occurring to me is, I think what we're essentially getting at is that any good story still needs to adhere to sort of the key fundamental structures of a good story. How you get there is sort of up to you, and there's really no right way to do it, but the end result does have some kind of parameters to it. I mean, any good story is going to need an inciting incident and you know, a big turn in the middle, and it's going to need progressive complications. It's going to need climax and then a good resolution after. Like, there's things that have to end up being there. So I think maybe, I don't know, would you agree with this, that it might be fair to say that probably people who fly by the seat of their pants could afford to learn to do a little bit of rough structuring ahead of time to think about at least what are some of those key pieces. And people like me who tend to way overplan and hyperframe everything could stand to do an awful lot less of that and focus on what are these key pieces, and then allow yourself to kind of create and play in between. You know, in both cases, there's probably some sort of a happy medium in there that, because like you said at the very beginning of this video, the key thing is what is going to help you write your words as well as possible, as quickly as possible, so you can tell your story and actually get it in front of readers. Instead of spending 5 years either, you know, stuck and lost in the morass of not knowing what you're doing, or spending all of your time framing everything and never getting around to writing it. Like, both of those alternatives end up meaning you don't have a finished story to share with other people, which is kind of the whole point. So really, it's focusing on what is it that gets you to that thing. Stylistically, it's sort of up to you, but whichever your natural preference is, it's probably a good idea to kind of investigate the other method and see if there are things you can learn from that other approach that will help you to write more fluidly and kind of get words on the page more easily, which is what we're talking about.
Well, thanks everybody for joining us here. And it was a lot of fun talking with you about flying by the seat of your pants, or surfing, or building a bridge, outline, whatever it is that you need to do to get better as a writer and put words on the page. That's what we want to see you doing. Have a great day.